Back in 1980, South Africa was in turmoil, as were several other countries in our immediate neighborhood. South Africa faced increasingly punitive economic sanctions and was finding itself politically and diplomatically more isolated. There were conflicts in Angola, where a Soviet and Cuban presence had been established. In Namibia, where SWAPO was engaged in a fight for national independence, and in Mozambique, where Frelimo was fighting to establish itself as the legitimate government of that country. And you have to recall the context that this was at the height of the Cold War, where the major powers showed an interest in developments in our part of the world, and were involved in one way or another in seeking to influence the outcomes of the various conflicts in the continent. So that's the starting point. Domestically, South Africa was moving towards a new constitution, which would provide for new and separate chambers of parliament for whites, coloureds, and Asians. That was the tricameral parliamentary system that came in and into effect in 1984. But the majority of the population was not included. They were supposedly accommodated in the respective homelands. Now, I mention this to provide a context in which South Africa's foreign policy subsequently evolved. The Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time was Pik Botha. You will remember him. And he was deeply concerned by these new constitutional proposals. And he said so wherever he went, much to the annoyance of his own colleagues in the National Party at the time. Now, if you followed the trajectory of Pik Botha, who was foreign minister for some 18 years, he was the one maverick in the National Party of the time. And right from the very beginning, his first maiden speech in Parliament, he said South Africa should commit itself to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and should work towards attaining the objectives in that Universal Declaration. Now, in the context of the time and in the political context in which he was talking, that was something akin to a religious heresy. But he was the one who was, perhaps more than anybody else, dragged the National Party of the time, kicking and screaming, into the 21st century. The difference, though, at the time was that the National Party was not a unitary party like the ANC is. It was a federal party, and the provincial components of that party had some autonomy. And members of parliament were also elected by constituencies. So the head office of the party could not simply tell a constituency who your MP is going to be. They chose the MP themselves, and so what saved his political career, perhaps, was that his own constituency and his own support base, if you like, among the white electorate in this country was substantial enough. But I mention this because he was to play a key role through all of this and the subsequent developments. These new constitutional proposals, this tricameral parliament, Pik Botha saw immediately as a fundamental problem. It would lead to more trouble. It was a country in internal crisis, and this was not a solution to the problem. It created a bigger problem. And this was, of course, put him very much outside the thinking of his own government colleagues at the time. He saw it as offering no solution, and he was already then, by the mid-1980s, he was arguing for the release of Nelson Mandela. And this was being considered in government, in cabinet, and the president at the time was P.W. Botha, you will remember, and P.W. Botha agreed to the release of Nelson Mandela back in the mid-1980s on condition that Nelson Mandela would renounce violence as a means to political objectives. P.W. Botha's argument was that if Nelson Mandela were to come out of prison And in the mid-1980s, there was unrest in the country. There was a nationwide state of emergency. There were enormous problems on the ground. If you released Nelson Mandela into this mix, you could set the country alight. And he was concerned that this was a problem. And if Nelson Mandela would say, no, I renounce violence, then he would be in a position to consider his release. The position of people like Botha and others was that this is a non-starter. Nelson Mandela can only be released unconditionally. You cannot prescribe or dictate conditions to him. He's either released or he's not. And this became a very powerful debate within the cabinet. And as you know, it took another 4 or 5 years before Nelson Mandela was eventually released. Now, the relevance of all of this to our foreign policy was that it allowed the foreign minister at the time, Botha, to argue to the world that South Africa's transition was already underway. This is a very important, fundamental issue to understand. It was a very, very controversial issue, but Botha could point to the events, imperfect as they were, in South Africa at the time and say to our interlocutors in Washington and in Germany and in London and other places that there is movement at last. We are breaking the mold. South Africa will evolve. You have to give us time. You have to give us some understanding. Continued international condemnation of the country is not going to help. He argued that if South Africa is going to make a successful transition to democratic rule, we don't want to land up at a situation where we finally make this political transition, but the economy of the country is destroyed and we have to start rebuilding there. The chances of a successful democratic transition are going to be that much more difficult. So that was his primary argument to the world at that time. But by that time, by 1980, the war in Zimbabwe had come to an end. Robert Mugabe had been elected as leader of Zimbabwe, the new government, which meant for the South African government at the time, it meant that the northern border of the country was at least secure. There was some stability that had come to the northern border. But the same did not apply to our eastern border in Mozambique, or to the northwest, in Namibia and in Angola, where the presence of large numbers of foreign troops posed a military threat. And there was little prospect of an internal solution in South Africa until all of the country's borders were secure. And that was a fundamental foreign policy position adopted by the government at the time. And that became the primary foreign policy issue, the security of our regional environment, that if there was war, civil war, unrest on our borders, that required the country's immediate attention. And we would not be able to proceed with the internal developments in South Africa until those issues had been resolved. And in practice, this meant negotiating peace in our neighborhood first, before attention could be paid to domestic solutions. And this involved a multi-pronged approach to solve several problems at once that threatened South Africa, and in that context, negotiations started in the early 1980s to try and resolve these regional conflicts that were surrounding us at the time. The first that came to fruition was the Nkomati Accord with Mozambique. That came about in 1984, and that brought peace of a kind to our eastern border. Angola was much more protracted and complicated, owing largely to the numerous actors involved there, as well as, by some estimates, 55,000 Cuban troops and their Soviet advisors that, in the view of the South African government, posed a serious threat not only in Angola but also in Namibia. But eventually, after some 10 years of negotiations, a peace deal for Angola was signed. The Cubans and the Soviets left, and the South African army withdrew from the area. And this was brought about by the tripartite agreement signed in December 1988 at the United Nations, and was something of a turning point, because the resolution of that problem and the withdrawal of foreign troops from our region and the prospect of peace in Angola meant that the next step in the process was independence for Namibia. We no longer had what was thought to be a dire military threat to Namibia posed by Cuban and Soviets and others on the border that threatened wide-scale bloodshed and an unending problem there. Once that threat had been removed, then there was nothing standing in the way, in the view of the South African government, for Namibia to have its elections, choose its own government, and go its own path. And once this happened, and Namibia came to independence, as you know, in the beginning of 1990, this meant that the South African government could now turn its attention to the internal situation. We no longer faced a regional threat. Now, this peace that came about was by no means a perfect one, and it did not happen in exactly the same sequence as Pik Botha had foreseen it, but he had driven this process. But nevertheless, imperfect though it was sufficient to free the South African government of the day from its regional anxieties and open the way for it to focus on the internal political situation. We're talking about foreign policy from the point of view of a practitioner here. And when I say that the negotiations to end the Angolan war took 10 years, that is in one sentence covering an enormous amount of work, endless meetings in the United Nations Security Council, in Cape Verde, in Brazzaville, in Cairo, all over the world. You'll remember in those days we did not have laptops and smartphones. And these were extremely complicated things about demilitarized zones and the withdrawal and the camps and all these things. The implementation of UN Resolution 435 for Namibia. Now, by that time, W. de Klerk had become president. And the decision for the release of Nelson Mandela and the unbanning of the ANC and the Communist Party was taken almost immediately after he became president. It took some months before it was announced in Parliament, at the opening of Parliament in 1990, but the decision was already taken. And this was primarily because de Klerk himself found himself as something of a minority in his own cabinet by that time. The inclusion of younger, more progressive ministers in the cabinet of the time, people like Barend du Plessis, Meyer, Leon Wessels, and others, it shifted the balance of power. And South Africa at that time was very much a cabinet government. That's where the key decisions were made. It was a cabinet-led government. And this balance had shifted. Younger people had come in who wanted to get on with the resolution of South Africa's internal problems and were in a hurry to do so. And so you had a situation where Pik Botha now suddenly was the number 2 man in the cabinet, but he was no longer a lone wolf. He was no longer a maverick. He now had a whole group of young members of the cabinet who were supporting him and were providing the support to de Klerk to go ahead and get on with it. The release of Nelson Mandela and the unbanning of these previously proscribed organizations and the prospect of constitutional negotiations to come, that changed our activities from the point of view of a practitioner quite fundamentally. Suddenly, those of us who were in the union buildings and who for so long had grappled with completely different problems, found ourselves inundated and overwhelmed by foreign diplomats coming in from all over the world. And they came to tell us that in the new situation, economic sanctions, or completely new diplomats telling us that their governments were considering entering into normal diplomatic relations with South Africa and opening embassies in Pretoria. So those were the two things. The lifting of economic sanctions and the opening of normal diplomatic relations with something like 80 or 90 new countries. And that occupied an enormous amount of our time, and all of it hung on one word. The word was, is the process irreversible? The test of irreversibility became the test as to whether sanctions were lifted and normal diplomatic relations were entered into with countries with whom previously we had not had relations. And they had to be convinced that we had embarked on a course that was irreversible before they could decide on their own next steps. Now, at the time, our response to them was that the South African government was not the only party to these processes, but so it could only speak for itself. But from the perspective of the South African government, it was indeed irreversible. There was no plan B. There was no going back to the past. We were confident that the other major parties to the negotiations shared this view, and hence had every reason to believe that this would have a positive outcome. But of course, as only one party to the negotiations, we could not give a guarantee that it was irreversible. We could only tell them that from our perspective it was. And if you want to know what the perspective of the other parties, please go and talk to them. But what happened then in that period, that quite rapidly, the economic sanctions that had been imposed on South Africa were whittled down, done away with. And a whole lot of new countries started opening, sending ambassadors to Pretoria, opening embassies and creating a new diplomatic environment for that.